Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. Norwich City have had a rare week between games, but they're back in Championship action tomorrow when they take on Cardiff City in the Welsh capital. We're going to preview that game tactically today. We're going to take a look at the Bluebirds' strengths and weaknesses, and also at Kenny McLean. What a big miss he'll be for Norwich, and why that is tactically. But we're going to start with my predicted 11, the players that I think Torrop will choose to go out there from the start, and it should be a fairly interesting round of team news when it comes out at around 2 o'clock tomorrow. So without further ado, here's the 11 I think Torrop will pick. So I've gone for George Long in goal with a back five of Kellen Fisher, Jose Cordoba, Shane Duffy, Callum Doyle and Ben Crezene, with two in the centre of midfield, Anis Ben Slimane and Emiliano Marcondes, with Ante Sianats on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent on his own through the middle up front. Now you'll notice there are a few changes in there, most notably perhaps a change to the system, and there are a couple of reasons why I think Torrop may go for that option. Of course, there is the McLean problem, which we'll come on to a little bit later in more detail. But in terms of what they've got to replace, it doesn't really feel like they have a like-for-like player who can step into that role, especially with Marcelino Nunez out injured. So then it comes down to, do you slightly change the role, or do you put someone who's fairly uncomfortable in that role, or do you completely change the system? And I think maybe, given what we've seen Torrop do at various times this season, he might be inclined to switch to that back five or that back three, depending on how you want to look at it. It's something he's done a couple of times this season, either to chase a result or to try to hold on to it. And it's clearly something he feels his players can do, even if he hasn't tried it over an extended period of time. And I think there is an argument for keeping the 4-3-3, as it is a fairly early stage in this sort of development of the tactical ideas that Torrop wants to impart. But I think they've had enough time, and Torrop at his pre-match press conference spoke as if they've had enough time to sort of learn the fundamentals of that tactical setup, and now they can maybe apply slight differences and changes. So I think the back five works in that sense. In terms of the players, you've got Slimane in there alongside Marcondes, and I don't think that is a perfect midfield two, but there really isn't much of a defensive option who can play that role for Norwich at the moment. Jakob Sorensen probably is the most defensive player they've got there, but of course he's only had very few minutes against Middlesbrough basically for the whole of the season, or at least going back to Oxford United on the opening day. He's been out with injury, and you'd be very surprised if he gets chucked in from the start for this one. There was an argument for maybe Kellen Fisher coming into midfield and Jack Stacey going to right wing back, but I think, or right back, if it had been that 4-3-3. But I think for the purposes of momentum and the fact that Fisher is in form in that position, maybe Torrop will keep him in a similar role. There's also the fact that Cardiff are quite strong in wide areas, and when we come on to them, I'll show you a little clip from Torrop speaking about their strengths. It sounds very much like he's aware that they've got good wingers, they've got good fullbacks, and that might be a problem area for Norwich if they don't defend well. And having that back five gives you obviously wide centre-backs. It gives you then wing-backs to add that further protection. And I think that might be the way to go, or the way that he sees it going into the game. It does feel like a fairly decently sized gamble, and I may well be proven very wrong when that team news comes out. But it's something that I feel Torrop maybe will lean towards, especially given the Callum Doyle problem that I think Norwich have had in the last few games. He hasn't really looked like a left back, and we all know how important he is in possession, and the fact that Norwich like to get him on the ball as much as possible. You combine that with the fact that they want to get Jose Cordoba and Shane Duffy in the 11 with the form that they've been in, and it feels like right now, to solve that left back problem and to have all of those players in there, maybe a back five is the only real potential solution. There's also the fact that Ben Crezene actually hasn't really put a foot wrong in yellow and green. I think he's been fairly unlucky to end up on the bench in the last few games, so it might be time to try him out. Equally, I know there are all of these other midfield options for Torrop to dive into. I think Fisher would be a decent midfielder. I think you've got the likes of Schwartau, even Forsen looked a little bit improved in that appearance as a substitute against Middlesbrough. So he has options, but for me, from what we've seen so far, I would maybe be turning to a change in system before I trusted players who don't really look like they're quite ready now, especially in a role that will be unfamiliar to them. So I could see that. And otherwise, there aren't really many other changes that you could see Torop making. Of course, there is still a bit of debate around the right wing role, but he seems to have settled on Ante Seaman, so I'd expect him to start there. Everyone else is in fairly decent form, and of course there are injuries that are barring some of those key players coming back in. So that's the 11 that I think could be possible, even if I'm not anywhere close to 100% sure, to be honest. Now, moving on to Cardiff City, and although I have done a little bit of research, I don't think there's anybody better to tell you about them than the head coach himself, Johannes Hoff-Torp. So here's a clip from the press conference on Wednesday where he talked about their strengths and some of their weaknesses, actually, and the way that it could pan out for Norwich this weekend.
They look in their best moments calm on the ball. They create some good opportunities with the two strikers that drop deep to receive in between the lines, and then to have these two wingers on the outside who can dribble and who can create some space and some width. Also on attacking teams where they want to bring their fullbacks as a part of that game. So we have to be solid defensively, and we have to avoid too many situations where they can break the lines for us and go in between us and create the game from these positions. It also gives us some opportunities on the counter if we are good enough in defending. So again, like always, when we prepare for these games, we have to go into details. We have to create a structure that fits, everything in the game, both defensively and offensively. And that's the same we will do for Cardiff, because I think they are in form at the moment, and it's going to be a tough one for us.
Now, we spoke a couple of weeks ago about the importance of the defensive line and their positioning, and at that point it was long balls that Norwich were struggling with. It was the space in behind their defence that had become a problem, but this weekend it's actually almost the opposite, and it will be important that they're able to close the space between them and the midfield, because that's where Cardiff like to cause damage. Callum Robinson and Ruben Colwill like to drop deep and pick up possession and turn and exploit the space between defence and midfield, as Torp alluded to just there, and ensuring that they don't have as much space as they'd like to be able to manoeuvre and to be able to get the rest of their attacking players involved will be really important for Norwich. Of course, that danger from out wide as well, as Torp mentioned, and that maybe is another reason why a back three or a back five maybe would benefit Norwich in a defensive sense. So a few things for them to think about at that end of the pitch, but there are a few positives as well, and one of those is numerical advantage in midfield. If they do go with a three in there, then they probably will have more players in there most of the time, because Colwill and Robinson, although in possession play fairly deep for attacking players or for strikers, out of possession they aren't really tied to that much defensive contribution, and that means Norwich could dominate a lot of the ball in midfield. It means that if they don't want to go for a three, they probably could go for a two and not be overrun, which has been the concern around a back three a lot of the time, but it does give that option to Torp if he wants to use it. And in terms of the control, which, as I've mentioned almost every week on Tactics Board since his appointment, that control is the most important part of what he wants to do on the football pitch, really. So some positives and negatives to that. As Torp said, there's also the option for them to counter-attack, and although they do like to have the ball as much as possible, they have proven that they can be effective when there's space for them to exploit, with the likes of Sainz and Sargent and Sienats, those athletic profiles to go and get at defences with their running. That could really suit Norwich, even though I'm sure they would prefer to control the game with the ball, but of course they won't be able to have it the whole time. And if they can exploit the Cardiff defence and weakness to the counter-attack at times, then they will have opportunities there, especially with the fullbacks and how much they like to bomb on. But again, that sort of reiterates the importance of strong defending out wide for Norwich, which can be a problem when those fullbacks invert, as we've spoken about previously. So a few things for Torp to think about there, but I'm sure he will still feel that he can get a team together that can beat the Bluebirds, even if he will be without Kenny McLean. As the large majority of you will know, this game marks the start of his initial 3-game suspension. The FA have also brought charges against him for his reaction to the red card that could see further punishment. But for now, it's a 3-game ban, and that starts when his teammates are in South Wales. And I think everyone knows what a blow that is, and that's why there's been so much discussion, as there was earlier, about how Torres replaces him and how he reacts to losing him. But I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into exactly why it is that he's so important and why it is that Norwich will miss him so much, because I think he does a lot of things that maybe people don't see. He looks like a bit of an all-rounder, but actually he's really, really important to some big parts of the tactical setup at Norwich. And one of those is ball progression. As I mentioned, it's all about possession, it's all about attacking, about controlling games with the ball for Torres. And McLean is a really key part of that. I think people see the importance of the defenders in that. Callum Doyle, Jose Cordova, even Shane Duffy this season, and of course Kellen Fisher, who's really stepped up in that department as well. But once it's got out of their feet, McLean is usually the next person in there, and he really is capable of turning slow build-up play into a fast attack. And that's actually quite a rare capability in the modern game. People are very, very careful on the ball, as you can understand, given it is all about possession. They're quite scared at times almost to lose it, and McLean doesn't really seem to have that fear, but he also has the quality, which I actually think is quite underrated, to make those passes come off and to start those attacks without much threat of losing the ball in key areas. He made the most progressive passes of any Norwich player so far this season. He's in the top 3 for passes completed. So you can see what a big part he plays in constructing those attacks, even if he isn't dropping as deep as he was under David Wagner and spraying as many long balls. He is really, really key to that. Out of possession, he's a really big loss as well. He's made the most tackles of any Norwich player, and actually there's only one who's made even half the number of tackles that he has, and unfortunately that's Marcelino Nunez. So a lot more defensive work to get around as well, and I think that highlights the difference in role that some of his colleagues will probably have to play this weekend. A lot of people see Anis Ben Slimane as the most natural McLean replacement, but he's often been getting the ball in an advanced 8 position, even in a 10 position, where he's only really 1 or 2 passes away from creating a real big opportunity for one of his teammates. And he isn't really used to being in that position where he's taking the ball off centre-backs, where he's starting attacks, where he's making a lot of tackles as well and a lot of defensive interventions. And that is something that he's going to have to really work on, because although we've seen he's a bit of a physical unit, he maybe doesn't cover the same yards that Nunez would, that McLean would, and he might have to up his game in that sense, as will Emiliano Marcondes, who I think we can all see has much more fitness than maybe people were expecting after a few months without a club officially. But equally, he's been doing a lot of that in terms of pressing and going forward and trying to win the ball high up the pitch. Now he's going to probably have to adapt that to do a bit more defensive work, to make more tackles, to be in those areas. And I think he does have the willingness and the desire and the work rate to apply that, but it is quite a different mindset trying to prevent things than to win the ball high up and to create things, and it's a different sort of pressure. So I'm not saying they won't be able to replace him. Of course, it will be a very difficult one, and it will take a little bit of adaptation to the role and adaptation to mindset. And given the run of form that Cardiff have been on, 5 games unbeaten, it will need to shift quite quickly, and that's the problem for Norwich at the moment. But I'm sure they'll back themselves to get a decent result in the Welsh capital. Of course, we'll have every kit covered across our channel, so go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of that fantastic content, if I may say so myself. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you again very soon ahead of the Sheffield Wednesday game, and hopefully that's off the back of some momentum on the road.